Okay, welcome back. This is part 5 of how to build the Wilson TS 3D printer. I have here in front of me the assemblies that I built in the previous videos. So I've got the Y-axis, the X-axis, I've got the upright frame here, and the extruder assembly. I've also got the electronics that will go on the printer, Arduino Mega with the ramps shield. I've got the smooth rods and the threaded rods for the ZAxis. I've got my heated bed and a glass sheet to go over the top of it. That's what the printer will print onto. And then I've got the two remaining motors. I've got a LCD display that will attach to the ramps that I'm going to mount on top of the printer, and plastic parts for that, as well as for mounting the filament spool on top. And then in the back I have the power supply that I'm going to use, which is a 500 watt ATX computer supply. Now for this video I've moved the camera to the side, as you can see, instead of above me, so that hopefully you'll be able to see as we start to assemble everything up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by moving everything out of the way except for the upright frame and the Y-axis, and we're going to attach those together. Okay, so there's all that moved out of the way, and we have our Y-axis and our frame here. And to start out, let's just turn these around and think about how we're going to attach them. The motor mount of the Y-axis goes to the back, and the two motor mounts on the frame should be to the front, and then these brackets on the bottom will go one on each side here of this lower brace, and then screws are going to hold those, and that's what's going to essentially, these four brackets are what attach these two parts of the printer together. So we have a choice here of how far we want to actually attach these two, since they're completely separate at this point. And the way that you want to go about determining that is that when the print bed is all the way to the front side, so our extruder will be here, it's moving back and forth like this, and when this is all the way to the front towards me, you want the tip of the extruder to be right at the back side of the print bed. And our print bed is a little smaller than this MDF, so maybe about where these screws are. And the extruder will be on our X-axis, which will be mounted here later, and it'll end up with the tip of the extruder about 70 millimeters in front of this frame. So that puts it about here. You know, if I just kind of visualize it or eyeball it, that's about where we want. We want it about this far. Now, the actual distance that we want for this setup is, we want 12 centimeters from the inside of here to the lower frame brace. And because these parts, the blue bracket here is 30 millimeters long, that means we want 90 millimeters from this plastic to this plastic. So with that number in mind, set this aside for a second and tip this up, and we'll get our calipers, or you could use your ruler for this, and I'll just measure off, set my caliper to 90 millimeters. The exact amount isn't what's important, but the two sides being the same is important. So I'm just going to hold that against there with my thumb so that it's snug, and then tighten this down, and then turn it over, and now make this one the same. and then double check. And the reason it's important that the two be, as close to the same as you can get is because the Y-axis is going to move along a nice straight line based on these rods, and your X-axis is going to move along its rods. But if these two braces are not the same distance, then your printer is going to print parallelograms instead of rectangles. Anytime the Y-axis and the X-axis are moving, they're supposed to be moving 90 degrees with respect to each other. So double check this and make sure that you've got that space the same. And then once you're happy with that, set the Y-axis up like this so that those are towards you. And then you're going to need something about 150 millimeters, about the same height as this. And what works out well for that, I've found, is your standard PC power supply. It just turns out is almost exactly the same height. So set that back here. Get your frame, and we can rest the top side of it on there while we put the lower side here. There. Don't let that fall off. Okay? And if your power supply is a different size or you don't have one to use for this, just stack some books or something underneath the far side so that the frame here is level, and then that'll allow you to work here without having to support everything or have a third or fourth hand. So we're gonna attach these upper braces to here, and first you want to center this left to right. So it should be around 50 millimeters on each side. You can just kind of eyeball it, and move it around until you're happy with it. It doesn't have to be exactly centered. And then find there should be 2 T-slot nuts in this here. Oh, here's one. Move them so that they're underneath there. And then you're going to need 4 of your M5 by 10 millimeter screws that you should have left over from earlier. And well, these are still loose. Put these 2 in. That's going to make sure that this is firmly against here, and then tighten the other one. Okay, now you can turn this around, and we don't want to put a lot of stress on things, but you should be able to just set this upside down like this, and then look in from the top here. Turn this so you can see, and find the 2 T-slot nuts and move them into place and attach these last 2 screws. be done with our power supply for a little while, so you can move that out of your way. And now the next thing that we'll do is it's time to attach the ZAxis rods and motors. For this next part of the assembly, what we need to do is get our XAxis mounted onto the smooth rods for the ZAxis. And the way that I would go about doing that is set your XAxis here with the motor on the left and pointed down, and get your 2 smooth rods for your ZAxis and put one into each X-ins linear bearings. Be careful to put them in nice and straight, don't rush it. You could damage one of the bearings. And then take the whole assembly now, real carefully, and the motor should be pointed to the back, and find these 2 holes on the motor mounts here at the bottom, and you might notice that the 2 X-ins are kind of floating on these rods, and that's important because as we get them into place here so that both sides fit into the lower mounts, the 2 X-ins are gonna find the right position like that. And then just raise the 2 smooth rods up and push them into these upper holes. And these are relatively, this one wants to slip, but these are relatively snug, so they're not going anywhere right now. Then get the 2 motors, the 2 ZAxis motors. And these motors are identical except for one has short wires and one has much longer wires. And the longer wired one needs to go on the right side of the printer because the electronics will be on the left. And put those underneath each one of these. There's a little cut out a little mouse hole in the bottom of these lower Z motor holders that's there so that you can put the wire right underneath or right through the side like that, so that it's not trapped inside there. And the wires could come off one of the other sides, but I think it looks a little tidier this way. Then get your remaining M3 by 10 millimeter screws. You'll need 8, and attach the motors. Okay. Next, get the 2 threaded rods for the ZAxis and the 2 couplers that you're going to use to attach these to the tops of the motors. These can also just be a short, stiff piece of vinyl tubing that's just large enough that you can thread one end of the threaded rod into, and then you slip the other end down over the shaft of the motor and zip tie it on. I've done that and it works well also. I'm going to use these today. And take each one and they just go down to these guides at the top, and then real carefully thread that through the nut that you pressed into the X end earlier. Be careful not to push it out of its spot. You might just hold it with one finger while you do this. thread this all the way down until it rests on the shaft of the motor. Okay, now if you're using the tubing, you'll just raise this up. You would have already slipped the vinyl tubing down over the motor shaft, and then you just want to turn or press the threaded rod down into there until it's tight. For these flexible couplers, you loosen the set screws first and then set one on each motor. Lower this back down and then slide it about halfway up. And then check when it's tight. You won't be able to turn the coupling without the threaded rod turning. You gotta really tighten these down. And now would be a good time to put your timing belt on for the X-axis. So turn the machine around and get the piece of timing belt that you have left. And start by feed it from the bottom side of the idler bearing and then up over the top. And then this loose end that you have here, just take enough that you can put it down into the slot with the grip little groove teeth. And then have enough left over to get the belt around. That's not quite enough. So that the belt comes back. And you can tie wrap it on to keep it nice and secure. That's probably a little more than I actually need, so try not to waste any. And I'll just leave that as is for a moment. Make sure your belt's not turned like that. So the teeth of the belt should be faced up on this bottom run, and then feed it through the bottom side of the motor. And around the pulley and back through. Check again along the whole length that it's not twisted. I got it twist in there. And then just like you did on the Y-axis, pull this. I'm holding the X carriage here with my left hand, and then I pull the belt nice and tight and then push it back down into that groove and around there. Make sure it's all the way down in there. And there's enough left on each side now. I can take tie wrap. Just tighten it down against itself. And then trim those off. And if you've got more than a centimeter or so of leftover belt, like I do on this side, you can trim it off a little closer. Leave yourself a little bit in case you need to take this off and try again. Okay, so it should be in place. Make sure it's tight before you move on. I'm going to try to show you a close-up before I move on, in case it's hard to see on the video how that belt should look. There you go. Okay, now, earlier I missed a step, and I'm going to go back and put this in the comments of the video, but I should have gone ahead and drilled the holes for the heated bed into the MDF while I was drilling the other holes for the bearing holders. It just slipped my mind, so I'm going to do that now. It would have been easier to do it then, but it's perfectly okay to do it at this point. You'll just get the heated bed and get a pencil and mark each of these holes and then drill them with the same 9/64 bit that you would have used for the other holes. And don't be too worried about making sure that your heat bed is perfectly centered. Just find a good spot for it and mark the holes. I'm gonna grab my drill. Okay, so I got my holes drilled in there, and now we can put the heat bed on. Before you do, you should turn the lead screws on the ZAxis just to get the X carriage up and out of the way. An inch and a half or so will be enough, and then put this on. I'll put the wires to the back, so obviously they're not in the way, and then you'll need 4 M3 by 30 millimeter screws, and 4 springs. This is a lower tension spring than what I used for the extruder. An inch, 3/4 of an inch, somewhere in that area would be long enough. These are 3/4 of an inch. And 4 M3 lock nuts. And I've also got 4 M3 washers here. So the way I mount these is on each corner. I have a spring M3 by 30 with the washer in from the top, and then a lock nut underneath. If you don't use a lock nut here, then as it vibrates from use, it's going to just loosen. And then the nice thing about the setup like this is it's fairly easy to adjust the corners for leveling, and also the spring makes it so that if the extruder runs into anything on the print bed, it has a little bit of relief, it won't hang up. So just do that on each corner. And now we're all set to attach the extruder. So it attaches by 4 bolts that should line up between the extruder body and the X carriage. And to do that, you'll need 4 M4 by 20 millimeter screws and 4 M4 nuts. Screws go in from the back, and then there's a inset into the extruder body for each of the nuts. It's a little tricky to get it started. And you might find, like here, that the bed is, the Z-axis is too low. The extruder's pushing down on our print bed, so just raise it up a little bit more until it's got a 1/2 inch gap or so. Oops. Be careful that you don't get the belt caught underneath that screw. It should slip in behind it. There we go. This one's real tricky to get in. It's tucked behind the larger gear. Okay. Now all of our basic mechanical pieces at this point are assembled. Next thing to do is to get the electronics mounted and connect all the wires.